For this video, I'm going to be showing you some information that is not listed in the On Cooking textbook, not for this chapter that we are covering here. So this is covered in chapter 19 of a different textbook that I use for my other classes, and this is over mixing methods. So when we're talking about mixing in baking, there's a lot of vocabulary terms that essentially mean take two or more ingredients and combine them. And so, how you do this, whether you do it vigorously or gently, is kind of outlined here in some of these mixing terms. So, beating is slightly different than creaming. They're not totally the same thing. Folding is completely different as well. It's a very gentle method of combining or mixing things in together. Sifting for your dry ingredients. Whipping and beating and creaming kind of have some things in common, but they are slightly different as well. Blending is a more generalized term that doesn't really specify. Cutting, kneading for dough is its own thing, and then stirring and blending are kind of interchangeable. And so when it comes to the mixing vocabulary, it can be very overwhelming and kind of confusing. So, when we talk about the mixing methods for baked goods, we are talking about how we blend our ingredients together and in what order we do so. So, for many of my students who perhaps their baking experience has only ever been from like a boxed mix or a packaged mix, I often find that they don't read the instructions and they put everything into the bowl at one time. And in most of your baking, that is not how ingredients are designed to be incorporated together. So, creaming method, biscuit or pastry method, and muffin method. These are the three most common methods that are used in baking, from scratch baking. And a lot of this has to do with the fats and how you incorporate the fat into what type of fat you're using and how you incorporate that into the rest of your stuff. So, whether you're going to get a soft cake like product, or whether or not you have a pastry product, or whether or not you have a flaky like a croissant dough, or something that's flaky or tender like a biscuit, like all of these results are going to be the product of how you put the food items together, and that does also include what temperature your food items are when you start. So for the creaming method first, the creaming method would almost always use a stand or hand mixer. And so you're going to actually want to put the fat with the sugar. And when we talk about fat, we are talking about usually, typically for this, you would be using like butter or even some shortening. Margarine is not 100% interchangeable with butter, but it can be substituted. Sometimes you can even use a butter margarine split. But when it comes to creaming, the margarine, because of the water content, is not going to whip up and do the same stuff that the butter is. So butter is really going to make a difference when it comes to creaming. We've tried this before. You can make some cookies with margarine and they turn out okay, but you're not going to get the same look when you cream them together. It looks kind of gross with the margarine, but when you make the rest of the recipe, it does okay. So the fat is put into the stand mixer, and the stand mixer is turned on. You can use a hand mixer. Generally, the paddle attachment, the flat paddle attachment, that's your most commonly used. You want to turn it on medium speed, and you want to go until it's very creamy. Now, you don't just do this until they're blended together. You actually want to incorporate air, and it will begin to rise in volume and be very, very light and very, very fluffy. Typically, I've been taught to turn the stand mixer on, get them together, and then once you see that they have come together, then set a timer for about 5 minutes. That's what I have my students do. About halfway through, I scrape the bowl down and then turn it back on. It's really important that your butter is about room temperature or a little bit below room temperature. You cannot accomplish this with melted butter, nor can you do it with ice cold butter. So set the butter out for just a little while. You don't really want to heat in the microwave if you can avoid it, because that'll kind of overly melt it. And so it should just be kind of soft to the touch. You should be able to push your finger down into the side. So cookies is the most common item that you'll find that is made with the creaming method, but there are also certain cakes, like the red velvet cake that I make, that is also a high fat cake used. So here's your directions here. So you want to cream your fat and sugar 3 to 4 up to 5 minutes. Then you add the eggs. You generally want to do that one at a time so that you don't break the web of air that you've created in the creaming process. Then you want to go with any other liquids. You want to blend them thoroughly. Make sure you scrape the sides at all times. And then you add in your sifted dry ingredients. And typically when you add your dry ingredients, you mix until just incorporated and then you kind of stop. You don't want to overmix. But for, if you remember from the gluten lesson, if you are creaming, you're generally using a lot of fat, and fat will help shorten gluten strands. So you're not as likely to overmix as you will with some of the other methods. For the muffin method, and this is for most of your quick breads, you want to mix the liquid ingredients and sometimes the sugar. The sugar is actually added sometimes with the liquid ingredients to dissolve it down with these recipes. So you can mix all the liquid ingredients. So you typically use a liquid fat like liquid oil or melted butter or margarine. And then you mix all the eggs and all the milk or water, whatever it is you're using. In a separate bowl, you sift together all of the dry ingredients. And then you actually want to slowly add the liquid to the dry ingredients. And then it's really important that you fold in or very, very lightly stir. So when making a product with this method, particularly the muffins, you fold it together until the flour is barely moistened, and then you stop. In some of our instructional videos, the chefs, like Alton Brown, he says like 12 times and then like you're done. Even if you still see a little bit of flour in it, you should be fine because it's so wet and so moist that it will eventually like soak up that flour. Cornbread, pancakes, waffles are also in addition to your quick bread or muffins. So banana nut bread, scones, blueberry muffins, chocolate chip muffins, and these would be the 2 bowl muffin method of mixing. Really important to make sure that you barely mix things together. So here's a photo here so you can see mix your dry ingredients, mix your liquid ingredients, and then barely pull them together. So the last one here is the biscuit method or the cut-in method or the pastry method. I have seen it called different things. Essentially for this one, it's really important that your ingredients are really cold because your final result should be kind of flaky. So when you are going for biscuits, pie crust, flaky pastry, croissants, those type of things, you want to keep the butter in little bitty, still solid form. You don't want a cohesive batter like you do with the other types of baked goods. So that's why it's really important that it's cold, because you are going to cut the butter up into tiny little pieces and you don't want to like smash it. You want to cut it. So you can do this with the pastry blender, which is you can see here in the photo, or you could do this with a food processor. So I typically take my food processor, I put my flour and dry ingredients together, pulse it once or twice just to mix them together, and then I put my butter, I cut my solid butter up into, I don't know, like 4 or 5 little pieces for the stick, put it in there, and then you want to pulse it, and you just keep pulsing it. Just hit the pulse button and stop, hit the pulse button, stop, and it'll kind of go around and then stop and go around and stop. And that will cut the butter into little pieces. You can take the lid off and you should still see little chunks of butter in there. And then you would add in the liquid ingredients, so milk or water, cold water. I think some pastry even calls for like cold vodka. I've read the scientific reason on why that one works better. I've made it before and it worked just fine. For some of your biscuit method or cut-in method, like if you're making homemade empanada dough, so you can do empanada dough and you actually incorporate an egg into it, and it is a little bit more forgiving. You can actually work it a little bit more, but if you're doing, the flakier the item is, the less you want to work it. So you don't want to melt the butter with your hands. You generally even want to rest it. So when I do pastry or pie crust, I do it and then I put it in a ball in a Ziploc or in the bowl and then rest it like in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes or so before I actually roll it out and turn it into whatever I'm going to make with it. So here's some photos here. So at the very top, you sift the dry ingredients, cut them into the fat until you see little pea-sized pieces. Combine the liquids and add to the dry. Don't over mix. Shape it into a little round ball. Usually I rest it there, and you want to kind of knead it maybe 2 or 3 times, but not very much. You're just kind of working it so that you can touch it and handle it. You should be able to touch this dough without it being too sticky on your hands to make things properly. So, not usually incorporated generally in the standard mixing methods is the single stage method. And most of my students have experienced that because that is the quick mix, the one bowl, or the dump method. And essentially, all the liquid and all the dry ingredients are mixed together at once. And for packaged cakes, biscuits, and baked goods, they generally rely on this method. And just make sure you read the directions. When you're making like a box cake, it's actually designed to be mixed together and then turned on and let it go and whip up and whip air into it for about 2 minutes. And that really does make a difference, even in your cake mix cake, on what type of cake that you actually get out. So you do want to whip that air into that batter, which is kind of important. But there are still the same ingredients in a cake mix. If you look, they just need to be hydrated, and so when you add the oil and you add the water, and then you add the eggs in there, then you hydrate that batter, but you incorporate that air too. The sponge method is actually where you do the creaming method first. So you do the creaming method and you create a batter, and then you separate your eggs, or don't use any egg. Don't use any of the egg yolk part or fat, but depending on what type. If you're using angel food cake, like you don't put fat in. Chiffon cake, you do. Souffle, you would. So you actually cream together some of the ingredients or sift together some of the dry ingredients, and you whip the egg whites into a foam. You make a meringue out of them, and then you very, very gently fold into the batter at the end the egg whites, which will lighten it up, and that helps leaven it. It creates air, and it changes the texture as well. So there's a couple of things that use the sponge method, but it's less commonly used than the other mixing methods, but you will see it used. So those are the mixing methods. It just has to do with what steps, what order, how you incorporate the ingredients, whether you have air or you don't have air, whether you have warm ingredients or cold ingredients, or soft or tender or cakey or flaky. It all just really depends on the mixing method.